Dear old Bunce Courtians, dear admirers of Anna Essinger, who I will refer to as TA, short for Tanta Anna, as that's what she was called in Bunce Court School. Please forgive me for speaking from a sitting position. Unfortunately, I'm suffering from an acute and painful problem with my foot, and it has been touch and go as to whether I will be able to make it today. As I don't feel on top of the world, I've made rather fuller notes of my speech than is usual for me, nor do I trust my memory these days, my great old age. My qualifications for this speech are really not too bad at all. Although I was in the school for only 3.5 years, the care, love and education I received there profoundly shaped the rest of my life, both intellectually and morally. I became very close to TA in her old age and frequently read to her when she was virtually blind and rather isolated in the hut behind the main building here. And on her death in 1960, her sisters asked me to give the oration at her cremation in Charing Crematorium. It would be remiss of me not to thank, on behalf of all present here, two groups of people. The Association of Jewish Refugees for yielding to my persuasion that TA is well worthy of one of their highly prized plaques. And it is wonderful that Frank Harding, a senior trustee, and Michael Newman, the AJR's CEO, are here today. Very special thanks must go to Susan Harrod, where is she? Who worked her socks off over quite a long period to bring this ceremony to pass. But I don't think that without Julia and George Miller's enthusiastic and loving support, this event could ever have happened. Together with Susan, they have made some of the local arrangements, and it was their intervention that persuaded the AJR to include more than the barest information about TA on the plaque, and so deviating from their normal practice. I had rather failed to do that myself. So congratulations, Julia. Finally, Julia and George, despite protestations from me, have made themselves responsible for the refreshments that will follow the ceremony, and we are massively grateful to them both, and also to the other residents of Bunce Court. As Frank Harding has already said so eloquently, TA was a very remarkable woman. She spent the years of World War I in Wisconsin in the USA, where she obtained her master's degree, and where she had come under the influence of the Quakers, and she remained a Quaker all her life. On her return to Germany, immediately after the First World War, she worked for the Quakers to provide food and clothing to thousands of starving and neglected children. By creating her co-educational boarding school in Herlingen near Ulm, she introduced the concept of Reformpädagogik into the German educational system, which had been up to then incredibly rigid. Her school was run on very liberal, child-centered lines that had much in common with the schools of A.S. Neal's Summerhill School in Suffolk and Dartington School in Devon. Rules were kept to a minimum, and a high degree of self-discipline was expected from the children. The relationship between children and teachers, who were often called by their nicknames, was highly informal. Not all the children were from the continent and Jewish, for some English parents were with left-wing views thought of the school as absolutely right for them, for their children. Harold Jackson, who's here, where are you, Harold? Harold Jackson, who's happily here with us today, likes to remember his bewilderment when early in the war he found himself surrounded by the enemy. Augustus John's granddaughters were also in the school. An important aspect of TA's educational approach was to engage the children in practical work of one kind or another, from work in the kitchen and wood workshop to gardening and housework. In Bunce Court, this became an absolutely essential at a school which was constantly short of funds, couldn't employ professionals to do the work. In late 1938, after Kristallnacht and the panic-stricken organization of the Kindertransports, TA was asked to help in the setting up of a reception camp at Dover Court near Harwich, and especially its educational facilities. This she did with the help of one of her most senior teachers, Hannah Bergers, and a few of her older children. She took into her school in Bunce Court some 50 or 60 children from the camp, enlarging her school buildings by the erection of wooden huts, those boys' houses, which accommodated some of the older boys. I was among the lucky ones to be selected. TA was very stout and incredibly short-sighted, and some children were frightened of her, undoubtedly. She did not have much of a sense of humor, if I can say that. One day she happened to open the door of an outside toilet and saw a boy sitting on the seat and exclaimed, "Sit up straight, boy!" Strangely, sex education, at least for the boys, was minimal or non-existent. TA told a group of us on one occasion, "If you ever feel the urge come upon you, take a cold shower." That was the extent of my sex education. She did not involve herself in teaching, but was the organizational genius who ensured that despite never-ending financial crises, the school remained solvent. But equally important was the fact that the school remained true to her ideals. She was unquestionably the leader who had a clear vision of what the school should be, and she appointed all the staff. She was well supported by her two sisters, it should be said. Tanta Paula, who was a trained nurse, who was in charge of the school sick bays in a special hut behind the main building, and also looked after some of the smaller children in what was known as the cottage down the hill. Her sister-in-law, Frau Kahn, a rather domineering personality who was not particularly popular, was in charge of the linen cupboard and all washing arrangements, a thankless but essential role. The staff were partly German refugees themselves and were most hugely overqualified. For example, Helmut Schneider had been the head of a small co-educational boarding school in Germany, and a gifted pianist. He worked in the garden. Adolf Prahl, who taught math, was a brilliant mathematician and taught mathematics in Bunce Court until he left for public school in London. The Boilerman had been a well-known theatre director in Germany, who of course organized some wonderful school plays. Lotte Kardischer, a gifted violinist, taught music, and so on. And Hannah and Hans Meyer were popular teachers. Their son Joseph was born in Bunce Court. They had a cottage not far away in Doddington, where later reunions of old Bunce Courtians were held in their extensive garden. But other staff were English and often conscientious objectors. Prominent among them, Norman Worm-Leighton, known as Wormy. He taught English brilliantly and had a good tenor voice, so that he was able to take the part of Papageno in the production of part of the Magic Flute, which was performed in the amphitheatre behind the building here. And the Red Dean of Canterbury, as it was known at that time, invited us to perform this opera in the chapter house in Canterbury Cathedral. A special mention must go to Gretel Height, a non-Jewish woman who had joined the school as its cook in the mid-30s. She was a lovely but temperamental woman, and helping her in the kitchen was considered to be a privilege, even though occasional frying pans were sent flying in one's direction when things went badly. She was highly popular with both staff and children, and was a sort of earth mother to some children. She sent me food parcels when I joined the army. She had the option of returning to Germany at the outbreak of the war, but opted to stay with the school which she loved. When she was interned on the Isle of Man, the standard of meals dropped precipitously until her return some months later. Now, one of TA's great achievements was to move the school to Shropshire when she was given 10 days' notice by the military authorities, as the school was in a military sensitive zone. To find a suitable building, Trench Hall near Wem, so quickly was absolutely incredible, even though some makeshift accommodation such as former stables had to be used for the older boys. Then soon after the end of the war, she moved the school back to Bunce Court, despite the fact that major repairs had to be carried out to make good widespread damage inflicted by the army occupants. By this time, TA was virtually blind, and it is extraordinary that she had the courage to move her school back to its home on the North Downs. There she took in a number of boys who had been in concentration camps or in hiding on the continent, and helped to restore their faith in humanity. Alas, money was in ever increasingly short supply. It became difficult to recruit teachers in such an isolated spot, and I suppose much of the raison d'etre of the school had disappeared. An attempt to find a successor founded on TA's stubborn unwillingness to have someone with somewhat different educational ideas take over, and the school was closed in 1948. Whilst a few children almost inevitably unhappy, separate from their parents and living a communal life which they had not been used to, the great majority are found in Bunce Court a safe haven, a home, and a caring society on which they were able to build a successful lives. Some, like the painter Frank Auerbach, who unfortunately can't be with us today, achieved national fame, but I don't know of anyone who didn't find his or her feet in later life. TA's achievements were indeed formidable, and it is wonderful that we have at last been given this opportunity of acknowledging this. In Germany, she is quite well known. In England, she is virtually unknown. But in Germany, her name has been revived by people like Hans-Jörg Reimel, who will talk after me, and who was very much instrumental in having a school named after her in Herrlingen near Ulm, the town in which she was born. And another school in Berlin was named the Anna Essinger School only 2 or 3 years ago, a great sign of the respect that German educators have for TA. So thank you very much indeed for listening.